Welcome again! It's time to talk about Sega's add-ons from the mid-90s and kind of a philosophical point of view of what they should have done. We all know that they released the Mega CD / Sega CD and then later the 32X in an attempt to compete against Nintendo and the technical capabilities of the Super NES. Sega really wanted to outdo things and, well, even though I'm a big Sega fan myself, I totally love the Megadrive and, well, it's my favorite 16-bit system. I'm also aware of its glaring flaws and limitations when compared to the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo had really good color capabilities, something that the Megadrive simply lacked due to it being released 2 years earlier. When the Megadrive was released in 1998 in Japan, that 64 color limitation wasn't really a problem. It was really good for the time, but arcade machines already had more color capabilities, and then Nintendo came with the Super NES in 1990, and it could display 256 colors out of a palette of over 32,000 colors. It was a lot more colorful. Around 1990 this wasn't really much of a problem. But let's go ahead a little bit further to, let's say, 1993, 1994. The Megadrive is really starting to show its age and already has an add-on in the form of the Mega CD, which can do some really decent arcade ports like Final Fight, which I think is the best home conversion of the game until that point, excluding the Japanese X60000 version and the later PlayStation 2 port in a Capcom Classics collection. At the time this was a really good arcade conversion. And of course you have games like Afterburner, Core Design's Thunderhawk and Core Design's Soulstar. Games that make really good use of the Sega CD hardware. Games that are not FMV games. Games that really utilize the scalar technology, although Final Fight doesn't, but those two games from Core Design and also Batman Returns' driving stages really make good use of the scaling and rotation features of the Sega CD. So I've always felt that the 32X was a bit of an unnecessary console, a thing that really shouldn't have existed. In my opinion, there really wasn't a need for it. It didn't really solve a problem, because there wasn't really much of a problem. I think the Megadrive's only real problem was perhaps its limited color palette, but everything else was pretty much up to spec, especially if you take the Mega CD into the equation, which, well, combined Megadrive with Mega CD is a machine that pretty much smokes the Super Nintendo in a lot of ways, except for its color depth. So what could Sega have done instead? Well, instead of the 32X, they should have made a Megadrive Pro. That is a concept that I was kind of thinking about from a philosophical point of view. So, what is that philosophical point of view? Well, it's the Megadrive Pro, so let's dive into it. Here I have my concept, the Megadrive Pro, where Sega shouldn't have bothered with the 32X and what they should have created instead. The 32X in a nutshell. The 32X was a failure, an ill-fated attempt at trying to outdo the Super Nintendo. I mean, it was the console wars. In the mid-90s it was all about bits. The more bits, the more better. Or so it seemed. Well, the Atari Jaguar proved that there was a lot of lies in marketing when it came to bits, and not many people understood how the bits worked or what it really meant for games. Sega's logic was pretty simple, just like with Atari with the Jaguar. Oh, we just call it 32X or 64-bit, 32-bit, and people will think it's better. Sega Genesis is 16 bits, 3DO is 32 bits. The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clever! Which is more advanced? Jaguar, Jaguar, Jaguar! Do the math. Of course, it's not really true. As we'll get into that a bit later. It was complicated to set up and not really a next-gen system. One of the problems with the 32X is of course that you had to hook up extra cables, especially a video mixing cable, so the video output of your Megadrive or Genesis would hook up into the 32X and that would hook up into your TV. It was complicated, but this was because of a technical limitation of the host system. Sega of Japan wasn't keen on it, the Saturn was already in development. Also, the 32X was a concept that was made by Sega of America, and Sega of America and Sega of Japan didn't really quite work well together. There were a lot of language barriers and different points of views in how they saw the future of the company and their product vision. The 32X was half a Saturn. It uses both Hitachi SH2 processors like the Saturn, and that's about it. And it has an enhanced VDP chip, which is really just a VGA-like frame buffer. It doesn't have any hardware sprites. It's just kind of like a frame buffer basically, that can output a lot of colors, but yeah, it doesn't have any hardware sprites or anything like that. It wasn't a developer-friendly machine. Again, it has this weird dual Hitachi SH2 architecture that was already bad enough in the Saturn, and well, it was just as worse with the 32X because they also had to synchronize it with the 68000 and the Z80. It was a complicated architecture that developers had to learn. It was kind of designed from an arcade machine point of view, and it's not something that Western developers were particularly familiar with. It used video overlays. Some games used Megadrive Genesis VDP for drawing its sprites. Yeah, that is the thing. It's because of the frame buffer design. It could only really draw backgrounds, and all the sprites, they either had to be drawn by the Megadrive itself, where they had to adhere to the same limitations as Megadrive games, or they had to use software sprites, which some games like Space Harrier did, which don't quite have the performance that hardware sprites can have. It was a bit over-engineered for what was needed. Yeah, they really wanted this thing to be next gen, but of course they never achieved that. So they just went way too far with the technology, and they just didn't really achieve what they wanted. At least not what developers and consumers perhaps wanted. It didn't use CD-ROMs for the most part. Yeah, there are only 2, maybe 3 32X games that can be used with the Sega CD, where the game is actually on a CD but requires a 32X. Very messy setup. It was bulky and messy. Well, we all kind of know what a Tower of Power looks like. Only 3 to 4 games that are noteworthy out of a very small library. When it comes to the 32X, I think only Space Harrier and Afterburner and perhaps Knuckles Chaotix and Doom are perhaps the only somewhat noteworthy games that I consider worth it. And perhaps Star Wars Arcade. The other games are pretty much forgettable and passable. And some of the games are, well, almost the same as the regular Megadrive version. They don't look that much better than a standard Megadrive game. Consumers absolutely didn't like it. They waited for the Saturn. The problem is that this thing came out about a year before the Saturn, and well, the Saturn was going to be better. It caused a lot of confusion with consumers. Did they have to wait? Could they buy it now? Would it be worthwhile pursuing a 32X, etc.? Well, the reasons why it existed. There was of course a very fierce competition between Nintendo and Sega in the 16-bit console wars. The Megadrive was showing its age. It had limited color depth compared to the Super Nintendo. 64 colors was good in 1988, but not in 1994. It was a sympathetic idea from Sega of America. Create a basic upgrade to your existing 16-bit machine and have next-gen games, even though they weren't quite next-gen. Reasons the 32X flopped. Well, the price. It was quite expensive, just like the Sega CD, but the 32X was discontinued only after about a year on the market, whilst the Sega CD lasted for a good 3 to 4 years. And it had about 200 games made for it. It hardly leveraged the already existing CD add-on. And that's, I think, where the 32X just shows how redundant it is. If the Megadrive had been slightly better in color capabilities, then perhaps they really wouldn't have needed the 32X, and the Sega CD as an add-on would have been good enough. So I think it is a solution to a non-problem. The Sega CD was powerful enough, but it never got utilized properly. There were a lot of FMV games released for it, which seemed novel at the time, but in hindsight they just haven't aged well. It was too late, because the Saturn's release was already around the corner. Consumer confusion, too many systems, what to buy? Limitations of the Megadrive versus the SNES. Of course, I have both a Megadrive and a SNES and other Nintendo and Sega systems. I have more Megadrive games than SNES games, but I have more NES than Master System games. And quantitatively, my collection has more Nintendo games than Sega games, even though I love Sega more than Nintendo. But yeah, I have to admit, the SNES simply outputs better graphics when it comes to color depth. And yeah, it's just a limitation of the age. The Mega Drive was there first, it is 2 years older. And the SNES just has the advantage of being slightly newer. Well, there aren't much any other limitations, because the Mega Drive itself is quite fast, it has a decent CPU, the VDP is fairly flexible, the FM sound chip I think is absolutely brilliant, and well, combined with the Mega CD it becomes a very powerful system. Super scalar graphics, almost. At least it is a bit wishful thinking perhaps, but when you see certain games like the driving stages in Batman Returns and games from Core Design that use the scalar chip, it's pretty impressive. The Sega CD/Mega CD, it has a quick CPU, it's 12.5 MHz. It has plenty of memory, 750 kilobytes of work RAM and 128 kilobytes of audio RAM, and that is just on top of what the Mega Drive already has. Just in terms of RAM, the Mega CD plus Mega Drive really outperform the Super Nintendo there, and they are, well, more like an Amiga almost in terms of memory. It has a great 8-voice PCM sound chip that, is pretty good, because it's a chip from Ricoh that was also used in a Sega arcade machine, the System 18, and well, it's decent. It can do 32 kHz samples, it has a 16-bit DAC, even though the samples are 8 bits PCM, it's still decent. It has CD audio playback, something that the Super Nintendo will never able to do. Hardware scaling and rotation similar to the SNES, but more advanced. The SNES can only do hardware scaling and rotation on background images, but the Mega CD can also do that with sprites, and that makes the design more flexible. Problem is the limited color depth, but this is really just an effect of being an add-on to the Mega Drive, and it still uses the Mega Drive's graphics chip as its host system. What the scalar chip in fact does, it pre-computes tilemap data on the fly in real time, and it just streams it into the Mega Drive's video memory, and that's perhaps where the blast processing comes from, because it is just streaming data up the Mega Drive's clacker. Also, it is capable of some impressive arcade ports, such as Final Fight CD. This game has graphics that are almost as good as the arcade machine, aside from the color depth. Its sound is very good. It's better than the arcade machine. It has really good voice samples. The music in particular is CD audio, and that's where it is better than the arcade machine. But overall it has everything pretty much that the arcade version has. That, well, the Super Nintendo version, as we know, lacks at least one stage and is only one player and lacks one character. This one has all the 6 stages and is a 2-player game and has all the 3 characters. This was an excellent port. And really, there should have been more of this and less FMV games. There are some good games that make use of the scalar capabilities, such as Batman Returns Thunderhawk and Soulstar. The platform levels aren't anything special because they are ported from the cartridge game, but it's the driving game that you want to play. It is absolutely impressive and kinda gives you a taste of what super scalar games could be like on a Mega Drive. And then of course Soulstar has very impressive scalar graphics. Thunderhawk has some impressive scalar graphics. Also generally the Mega CD has impressive audio. A lot of the games use a CD audio soundtrack, and many games have improved voice samples such as NBA Jam. The voice samples sound really good on this one. Now let's take a look at the Mega Drive versus the Super Nintendo and the 32X when it comes to color depth. The Super Nintendo uses a 15-bit color system. It can display 256 colors from over 32,000 colors. The Mega Drive has a 9-bit color system which means only 64 colors simultaneously, although there are tricks to boost it up to 80 colors. And the main palette is 512 colors. But that is kind of excluding the shadow and highlight mode, because it is actually capable of a bit more. There are some videos from a former developer from Traveler's Tales, and that channel is called Game Hut, if I remember correctly, where he explains how the shadow and highlight mode and the color capabilities work. I really recommend you watch that, because it gives some interesting insights in the Mega Drive's color capabilities. So some games can briefly display about 80 colors at the same time using special programming techniques such as mid-frame palette swaps. And this should not be confused with the Amiga's hold and modify system. That is something completely different. There are some sources that say that the Mega CD does hold and modify, but that is probably something that a journalist in the past probably misinterpreted. The real trick is the shadow and highlight mode and things like mid-frame palette swaps. The 32X has a 15-bit color system like the Super Nintendo, but that's only half of the story, because it also uses the Mega Drive's graphic system on top of it, because it actually uses a video overlay technique. If you don't connect that video cable from the 32X to the Mega Drive, you only get the background. A lot of games use the Mega Drive to draw the foreground, such as the character sprites, and they still have to adhere to the same limitations as your usual Mega Drive games. This is why a lot of 32X games don't actually look all that good. Only the games that use software sprites and use the 32X's own graphics hardware actually look good or better. So here are some images from Wikipedia from an article about video game console color palettes, and it kind of shows you how these things look or compare. This here is well, what the Mega Drive is capable of. You got 512 colors as your main palette. That is excluding shadow and highlight, and you got 64 shades that can be displayed simultaneously. Actually, it's only 61 colors because of black. There are a few duplicates there when it comes to the color black. Then we have an example of a 15-bit color system that can display 256 colors out of over 32,000 colors. That is the case for both the Super Nintendo and the 32X. You can see how much softer these colors are, how many more shades you've got, how much nicer those gradients are. Yeah, and it just really makes a difference when it is put to good use. Here are some examples of what the 32X typically does when it comes to colors. Here are some bad examples, and here's a good example. Spider-Man Web of Fire. Well, what I've seen in a video from Sega Lord X, where he reviews games of the 32X and others. This is one of those games that really proves that a lot of 32X games did not get a lot of development behind them. Because developers thought that the hardware was difficult and they just used what they were familiar with, and that was the Mega Drive's graphics chip. Because it was easy, that is something they knew, and yeah, they just had very limited development time. I'd say watch some of Sega Lord X's videos on the 32X, and it kind of shows you what a disappointment the 32X really was and why Sega really shouldn't have bothered with it. Primal Rage, the same thing. This is actually the 32X screenshot, even though it really looks more like a Mega Drive screenshot. However, there are some positive examples. Some examples that really should have been. And this could have been possible had Sega made an improved Mega Drive with some technology from their arcade machines. This is Space Harrier, and this is not the arcade screenshot, but the 32X screenshot. Look at how nice these color gradients are. It uses the proper 15-bit color system, and that is because it doesn't use any of the Mega Drive stuff. It only uses the software frame buffer, which means that, yeah, the Mega Drive VDP isn't used here at all. Very different from Spider-Man Web of Fire and Primal Rage. And now it gets nasty. Primal Rage, the Mega Drive versus the 32X. Here on the left are the Mega Drive screenshots, and on the right are the 32X screenshots. Well, I don't see much difference in quality actually. In fact, I would say that the Mega Drive title screen here looks slightly better than the 32X's title screen. I mean, yeah, when it comes to the amount of colors used, the differences are not that big. I mean, would you be convinced if you saw that 32X screenshot that really is a 32X? You would think it's a Megadrive screenshot. And yeah, if you see them both side by side, and I've used the Sega Fusion emulator to capture these screenshots, you can tell that, well, they almost look identical. There's not much difference really. It's only here that gradient, that's the Megadrive version, and here you've got these clouds that don't actually look good at all on the 32X. And then this screen here, yeah, the differences are absolutely minimal.
Rage.
So, the Megadrive actually had a little secret, a very dirty secret, something that was a bit future-proofing from Sega's engineers. It is actually capable of being used with an external color palette generator or color palette memory. But the VDP chip also has its own color palette RAM, which is only 128 bytes in size. There is an arcade board called the System C2 that uses the Megadrive's hardware. It actually is able to output more colors, and it has an external color RAM which is 16 kilobytes in combination with some other chip. There is some sources on Sega Retro and where you can find some more information on that. But yeah, System C2, it's basically a Megadrive on an arcade board, but it is able to output more colors. And there is actually a game that was released on that particular system. This one, Thunder Force 3, and in the arcade it's called Thunder Force AC. The arcade version has slightly better voice samples because that arcade board also has a PCM sound chip on it, and the colors are slightly better. Pretty much runs on the same sort of hardware, except that they made a few minor upgrades to the system. So, the Megadrive VDP can actually use 128 kilobytes of VRAM. At least that's something that I've read on various forums. I don't have an authoritative source on that. Legend has it that Sega's engineers, when they created the prototypes of the Megadrive, wanted to use 128 kilobytes of video RAM, and so the VDP chip was designed around this. But in 1988, 128 kilobytes was still a bit too expensive. So in order to make the system affordable, they had to reduce that to 64 kilobytes. So theoretically, you could upgrade that video RAM. Although the System C2 doesn't actually do that. But there's another arcade board called System 18 that also uses a Megadrive VDP, and it might use 128 kilobytes of VRAM, I'm not sure, but I think I remember reading that somewhere. So the VDP chip was designed with some future extensions in mind, but it wasn't utilized in the home console. So what's it like to have the Megadrive VDP chip on an arcade board? Well, there's the System 2 arcade board, and I think I have a picture of it. Let me look for it. It's right here. This is a screenshot from the website called system16.com, which is a Sega arcade and other arcade history archive, and this is the actual board. And yeah, it's based on the Genesis hardware, the main CPU, sound and graphics, except it lacks a Z80 chip because it doesn't need it. But yeah, this is that Megadrive based board that can output more colors. And well, here's some other information about it. This is a more technical description. It no longer uses the internal color RAM for palettes. It's capable of producing 4096 simultaneous colors. It has an extra sound chip to play samples. And it uses this color encoder chip. And well, the main color palette is now over 90,000 colors. Although this is a bit weird. Here it says 4096 colors and there it says over 61,044 colors. Bit confusing. The System C2 low-cost arcade board and then System 18 is basically a System 16 with some tech from the Megadrive added on top of it. And they both use a 15-bit color system and can display, well, more colors than the SNES. So what is the secret here? It is the Sega 315-5242 color encoder chip. It replaces the VDP's internal RGB output and does some palette data remapping. It has an external color RAM which is much bigger. So, some side-by-side screenshots. I used MAME to make the arcade screenshots and Kega Fusion for the Megadrive screenshots. The Megadrive graphics are on the left and the System C2 arcade graphics are on the right. Notice how there's simply a bit more shading, or the colors are a bit softer. Even though it may not have more colors on screen, at least there's more choices from a color palette point of view that they could use. For instance, the Sega Game Gear is based on the Master System, but the Master System can display 32 colors out of 64 colors, but the Game Gear can display 32 colors out of 4096 colors. So even though it can display the same amount of colors on screen, it can pick them from a much bigger palette, so there's more variety. So, what could this alternative future have been like? Well, see this picture here? It's a picture of Galaxy Force 2, the arcade version. And this is Galaxy Force 2 on the Megadrive. A very nice game and quite a bold effort, even though, yeah, it could have been a lot more impressive had it been made for the Sega CD. But just look at this. This is a Sega Y-board game. Absolutely powerful beast when it comes to Sega's super scalar technology. It had three 12 MHz, 60,000 CPUs. It had very impressive graphical capabilities. Just imagine the Mega CD being able to do that in a somewhat downscaled way. I mean, a game like Soulstar is very impressive looking. Yeah, it's only limited by the color capabilities of the Megadrive. What should Sega have done instead? Well, instead of making a 32X, they should have made a Megadrive Pro, preferably around 1993. And well, they could have done just that with this thing. If they had just given the Megadrive 2 a little bit more VRAM and, well, an external color encoder chip, it could have output more colors and, well, together with the Sega CD could have been an absolute winner in kind of competing with the Super Nintendo. So, my vision is a system that was designed to enhance work with the Mega CD. So it would be a lot simpler for developers also. 15-bit color using the same hardware solution as the System C2 board, a 16 MHz CPU to support scalar games such as Space Harrier, Afterburner, Galaxy Force, a default clock speed of 8 MHz for compatibility, because there's a computer that does exactly that. This computer here, the Atari Mega STE, has a 16 MHz 60,000, but it can also clock at 8 MHz for compatibility reasons. So, a switchable clock speed, we're going to give this thing a turbo. We're going to make it twice as fast. Although existing software will use the 8 MHz clock by default. And I think this is quite reasonable because a lot of people seem to be into overclocking their Megadrive, and it seems like a 10 MHz clock makes Sonic run better. When Sonic loses his rings, there's no more slowdown, it's a lot smoother, there's less lag. Yeah, it just runs a bit better. So 16 MHz chip in combination with the 12.5 MHz chip of the Mega CD would have been an absolute winner. Also, my solution would have been a lot more developer friendly because it's a bit like the PS4 Pro. It is the PS4, but a bit better. It's the Megadrive, but a bit better. Yeah, same architecture, exactly the same architecture, but better specs, So a bit more room for developers. They don't have to relearn anything. Instead of having to learn that weird Hitachi SH2 architecture, they could just use the existing familiar 68,000 code that they already know and are already familiar with. They could leverage existing knowledge, existing development tools. It would have been so much saner, so much cleaner than a 32X. It would have had 128 kilobytes of VRAM, so twice the mega memory, and 16 kilobytes of color RAM, 4096 on-screen colors from, well, 98,000 colors with shadow and highlight. It would be an architectural evolution of the Megadrive Genesis. Games can optionally use the enhanced hardware and gracefully downgrade when you have a regular Megadrive, so a developer could make a game that would use more colors on a Megadrive Pro, but use the regular 64 colors on a regular Megadrive, and the same would apply to CD-based games. More focused on CD-ROM software, because that was the future, and I think that's what Sega should have done in the first place. Just forget about that 32X. They really should have done more with the Sega CD because it was awesome. It should have been tailored perhaps towards arcade ports of super scalar games and computer-based adventure titles, multimedia type of games, perhaps point-and-click adventures from personal computers. Jurassic Park on the Mega CD is a good example of this. Yeah, if it had more colors, the concept probably would have looked a bit better than it did. An optional MIDI interface and a basic PCM sound chip? What if we could turn the system into a musical instrument? Ooh, wouldn't that have been interesting? So focus on multimedia titles and arcade ports. The Saturn would still be released, but perhaps a year later. The Megadrive Pro could coexist in the market until 1997, 1998. By that time it probably would have to be retired, but then you'd have the Saturn to pick that up. It can work standalone to improve cartridge games, but it can also greatly improve the quality of CD-based titles. Even your FMV games would have looked better with more colors. Bottom line, easier for developers, inexpensive for consumers, easier to set up, a more seamless experience. Not quite next gen, but not overpromising like the 32X. So that was it. So there you have it, that was my concept of the Megadrive Pro. The system that Sega could have made in an alternative universe, in an alternative course of history. Something that they should have done instead of the 32X. I don't think I'll ever be interested in a 32X. I've seen enough Sega Lord X videos to be convinced that the 32X was really a bad step for Sega. They really should have done more with the CD system. And that's kind of what I would have liked it to be. Just better arcade titles, perhaps some point-and-click adventure games, more of a focus on the Sega CD. That I think was the true add-on. That's where they should have stayed at. They really just shouldn't have bothered with the 32X. The 32X, yeah, it just was a failure and an ill-fated attempt, but the Mega CD at least was a moderate success. Even though it was expensive, it still had about 200 games made for it. Yeah, there are some really good ones out there like Final Fight CD. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed my philosophical point of view. Thank you for watching and bye bye!